Welcome back to The Explainer. So, if you joined us last time, you might remember we actually followed Ernesto Guevara's famous 1952 motorcycle journey all the way across the vast landscapes of South America. Today, we're bridging the gap from that exact journey to the man he would eventually become. You see, during that 1952 expedition, Ernesto witnessed crushing poverty, heavily exploited workers, and profound discrimination against indigenous communities. He also saw firsthand the immense suffering of patients in really remote leper colonies. And those experiences, well, they laid a massive, heavy foundation for absolutely everything that followed.
But here's the absolutely crucial point to understand right off the bat. That motorcycle journey didn't just instantly transform him into a revolutionary. It wasn't some sudden overnight shift, you know? Instead, it was more of an awakening. It planted the seeds, the ideas, that would slowly but surely shape his worldview and literally the rest of his life. So this explainer continues that fascinating story, really tracking his evolution from a young doctor searching for answers to a figure who would eventually become one of history's most famous and for sure controversial revolutionaries.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We're going to map out a highly pivotal, action-packed 3-year period. We start right here in 1953 when he actually completes his medical degree. Then we move rapidly into the intense geopolitical tensions of the 1954 Guatemala coup, cross over into a historic 1955 meeting in Mexico, and finally, we end up on the incredibly risky 1956 Granma voyage.
To break that down, here are the distinct chapters of his evolution from a young doctor to a desperate fighter in the mountains. 1. A doctor's restless return. 2. The turning point in Guatemala. 3. A fateful meeting in Mexico. 4. Sailing on the Granma. And 5. Ambush and survival.
Chapter 1. A doctor's restless return.
So the story picks right up after he returns to Argentina in August of 1952. By 1953, Ernesto had officially completed his medical degree. And at this point, his friends and family naturally expected him to just, well, settle down into a comfortable, predictable life as a physician. But rather than starting that quiet medical career, the glaring inequality he'd witnessed left him deeply restless. So what does he do? He packed his belongings once again. He traveled through Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and finally Guatemala. He wasn't just aimlessly wandering, though. He was driven by this intense determination to truly understand the political forces shaping Latin America. He wanted to see exactly how the systems of power were operating right there on the ground.
Let's move to Chapter 2 and see how this builds. The turning point in Guatemala.
When Ernesto arrived in Guatemala, he found a country attempting one of the most ambitious social reform movements in Latin American history. On one side of the equation, you had President Jacobo Arbenz, who was enacting policies to redistribute unused land from massive estates directly to poor farmers, offering them a real sense of economic hope. On the flip side, powerful local landowners and the vastly influential American-owned United Fruit Company strongly opposed these reforms. Tensions were rapidly, and I mean rapidly, escalating, and Ernesto was right there, watching the whole shebang unfold in real time.
The breaking point came in 1954. The push for democratic reform was suddenly and violently derailed. A CIA-backed operation helped overthrow Arbenz's government, and almost overnight the social reform movement just completely collapsed. The hope of peaceful, democratic change was entirely replaced by street fighting, chaos, and military force.
Now, for Ernesto, this coup was the ultimate ideological turning point. The conclusion he drew was stark, and honestly pretty absolute. Democratic reforms alone could be way too easily overturned by powerful foreign interests. Because of what he witnessed in Guatemala, he increasingly believed that only armed revolution could bring about permanent, lasting change. With Guatemala suddenly completely unsafe for him to stick around in, Ernesto had to flee, making his escape across the border into Mexico.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, a fateful meeting in Mexico. Okay, so it's now 1955, and Mexico City is this bustling hub for political exiles. And it was here that fate introduced Ernesto to a young, incredibly charismatic Cuban exile named Fidel Castro. Castro was actively gathering supporters to overthrow the Cuban leader, Fulgencio Batista, having just been released from prison for leading a failed attack on the Moncada barracks back in Cuba. When these two met, they literally talked entirely through the night. Their conversation revolved intensely around politics, imperialism, and revolution. They found this deep, profound ideological alignment. By the time morning broke, Ernesto had made a life-altering decision to join Castro's movement. Interestingly enough, he didn't join as a politician or a soldier. Actually, initially, his role was simply to be the expedition's doctor.
Now, what's really interesting about this next part is a little detail you probably heard of. While in Mexico with his new comrades, Ernesto frequently used a common Argentine expression in his daily conversations. He would constantly say, che, which is very similar to saying hey or mate in English. Because he used it so much, his comrades just started calling him that. And just like that, the nickname Che stuck with him for the rest of his life.
But obviously, it wasn't all just talking and making friends. What followed were months of intense, secret preparation in Mexico. Che trained rigorously alongside the Cuban revolutionaries. They had to learn absolutely everything from scratch: guerrilla warfare tactics, wilderness survival, marksmanship. They were operating completely in the shadows, secretly preparing for an incredibly dangerous, full-scale invasion of Cuba.
And that leads us to Chapter 4, Sailing on the Granma.
After all those months of grueling preparation, the time for theory was officially over. On November 25, 1956, this highly trained, but, let's be honest, very small group of revolutionaries finally put their audacious plan into action. Their invasion force consisted of just 82 men. All 82 of them crowded shoulder to shoulder onto a single, small, aging leisure yacht called the Granma, setting sail across the really treacherous waters of the Gulf of Mexico toward Cuba.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how dire the situation was. Look at the odds stacked against them here. They were poorly equipped and heavily outnumbered by a professional national army. By almost any conventional military standard, they were completely expected to fail. It was an almost impossible David and Goliath scenario, taking on Batista's incredibly powerful and well-funded forces.
Chapter 5. Ambush and Survival.
So, their arrival in Cuba? It was an absolute nightmare, right from the muddy shoreline. First came a severely delayed and difficult landing, where they lost most of their supplies. Second, within mere days, before they could even organize themselves, they were brutally ambushed by government forces in what was basically a bloodbath. Most of the rebels were either killed on the spot or captured. Step 3 was just pure desperate survival. A tiny, fragmented handful of men managed to escape the gunfire and flee deep into the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the Sierra Maestra Mountains.
Out of the original 82 men who got on that boat, the core survivors who actually made it to the mountains included Fidel Castro, his brother Raul Castro, and Che Guevara. For these few battered men, the immense struggle to overthrow Fulgencio Batista was nowhere near over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And for Che, this absolute crucible in the jungle marked his permanent transformation from a traveling doctor into a hardened guerrilla commander.
Which leaves us with an incredible, really provocative question. So, how does a handful of survivors hiding out in the mountains with almost literally no resources manage to defeat an entire national army? Well, that's exactly the astonishing story we'll be uncovering in our next explainer. If you enjoyed this deep dive and you want to see how Che and Fidel changed the course of history forever, please remember to like this explainer, share it with a friend, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time!